So, without further ado, on the motion, this House believes that the WHO should adopt a convention which bans the sale of drugs with high resistant tendencies, ergo antibiotics, to countries which do not comply with WHO guidelines regarding their medical and agricultural use. We're very happy to call upon the Prime Minister. Hear, hear.
The success and effectiveness of drugs with resistance tendencies is directly contingent on compliance and enforceability. And Prime Minister, I'm going to bring you three clear things in my speech. First of all, how this leads to sustainable healthcare practices. Secondly, mechanisms for why this leads to countries complying with these regulations. And then thirdly, impacting of our case. But first of all, let's clarify what we're talking about here. So drugs with resistance tendencies are drugs that become less effective the more you take them. We think we want mechanisms for the WHO providing information, technocrats supported enforcing regulations, given that we think enforceability is the biggest problem leading to compliance. And the WHO has the infrastructure and the capacity to be able to assist with this in a way which on their own countries can't. So that's important in terms of a partnership, which the WHO currently does. There's massive precedent for this. In terms of which regulations specifically we're talking about, I think it's important to note that we're talking literally in lots of countries about the fact that you need a prescription to get antibiotics. In Pakistan, you can just get antibiotics like much regularly without actually having prescriptions. These are the kind of enforceability levels which you just don't have in a lot of countries. We're also talking about things like best practice in giving prescriptions, taking into account correct age, doses, correct diagnosis. In a lot of these countries, when these things are ignored, it leads to these drugs being not effective, and specifically meaning they're not effective in the long term, which means there's never a path to develop them into effective usage. That's massively important. I also think in terms of regulations about taking action on regulating the black market is also something which we think is important in this debate. In terms of where we're specifically talking about, because I think characterization is important here. I think mostly in terms of countries that don't comply with WHO healthcare regulations, we're talking about countries in the developing world. Obviously some exceptions, but this is a massive problem in terms of enforcement structures are massively lacking, and critically there's not incentive to implement enforcement structures all over the time. So in the debate here, we need to internalize healthcare systems and governments, giving them the benefits of compliance, which is you literally need to comply to be able to get the drugs. We think that's reasonable, a reasonable contingency, given that otherwise the drugs aren't effective, and that's specifically important. We think these are places where there aren't incentives to do it, which is exacerbated by lack of awareness about what you're doing when you're taking drugs. That means domestic populations massively pressure governments into being able to give them these drugs instantly, because they don't recognise that by taking them now, they're hindering their capacity to be able to use them effectively to treat endemics, etc. in the future. That's massively, massively important. So why do we need sustainable healthcare practices? This is the first important thing in my speech. So I think that it's important to explain resistance tendencies means that the more you use them, the less effective they get. That means that in comparison to other types of drugs, abuse now is worse than just abuse now as in people getting the wrong drugs, but it literally means you disenable those drugs from ever being able to be effective in the future, particularly given things like antibiotics. Different types of antibiotics build up the same immunity, which means that by abusing them now or giving them to the wrong people or mass distributing them, which I think is the biggest problem in a lot of healthcare systems, you massively destroy their capacity to be able to have them in the future, which prevents their capacity to do that because people have already got resistance. This means that even if you develop healthcare systems in the future and work towards a system where you make governments feel more positive about it, they're literally not able to treat the worst conditions because their population have already developed immunity and already developed resistance. We think this is an instance, thank you, of the WHO allowing healthcare services to basically self-destroy because they're literally right now destroying their capacity to use the tools which will be necessary in the future to be able to do this. We think this is the best mechanism to do this, given that if you just allow the availability of drugs or the sale of drugs to countries which then don't distribute them properly, that sale is not helping anyone because they're creating more problems than they fix. So I think on a balance, we take into account the future people who are disenabled by this because the medicine is less effective, and the people right now who are able to get it because it's less effective. That is a massive, massive impact. We think WHO has precedent to do this, given they always care about preventative measures. For example, think about distributing contraceptives, etc., is a way of preventing things happening in the future. So they weigh up the impact of what will happen, and that is necessary, given that the impact of having these resistant tendencies drugs on the market is massively harmful. So that's incredibly important. What are the impacts of this? No, thank you. Once an endemic happens and everyone's immune, you don't have mechanisms to be able to support that. And the WHO then has to channel millions and millions into developing new drugs to be able to take over what's happened, which is incredibly inefficient, incredibly slow, means more people die in the process, given that it significantly the antibiotics right now to be able to do this. That's a massive time, a waste of money, but most importantly, it's unsustainable given right now most developed countries who implement them properly have the antibiotics there, or the drugs there, which they regulate them properly, which means they're going to be dependent on that, which means there's not an incentive for the rest of the world to develop drugs which go beyond the drugs we have right now because they're using them properly. That means the developing world and the countries with low enforceability get left behind. Given that compliance is critical to the future sustainability of these drugs, that's the principle and the basis on which we think it's legitimate to restrict those drugs unless they're used properly. Opening? Did you have something? No, fine. Closing. Oh, no, closing.
Given you admit that these are systemic issues which you'd have to educate your whole population in medicine, you must admit that this ban will kill hundreds of millions till this country will be able to be effective and perfect.
The next part of my speech is about enforceability mechanisms. The thing is that right now people just want the drugs instantly because they see that's the only way for them to get better. When getting the drugs is contingent on compliance, there's massive pressure to comply because that's the only mechanism by which you can get drugs. We think these enforceability mechanisms are things like pleasing your people. So that's obviously like, voting in the system for democracy. It's also massive social unrest because being denied access to your drugs because your government won't distribute them properly is something you're going to get massively angry about. Governments want to avoid that because they want to give people the drugs and make them better. If the WHO imposes the conditions, it means you're likely to comply with the conditions. Let's look at this specifically. I think it's important to analyse how these countries haven't complied up until now. Firstly, because regulations aren't punitive, it's incredibly easy to be complacent because you have nothing to lose. Secondly, because you have short-term incentives to just give out loads to make you feel better without thinking about the long term. And thirdly, and this kind of engages with the POIs, people put so much pressure to get the drugs now without thinking about what's best. This debate is about changing the incentives because now that getting the drugs is premised on responsible use, you have massive incentives to be able to do that, especially given the motion talks about agricultural use. Given that there are massive economic dependency on agriculture, presumably drugs that are valuable for them, you get a massive, massive push to make the government be able to comply with that, to be able to do this, to be able to keep your population happy. Given the sustainability of governments and the ability to build up state capacity depends on having buy-in from your population, you're likely to comply with regulations which are simple to comply to. It's things like needing a prescription, which you need to develop healthcare systems to do. But specifically, secondly, another mechanism is that the government right now can skate over issues of bad distribution because no one really knows about it. But now your refusal to do so gets you so much scrutiny from the WHO, from international pressure, international media sources, which publicise the fact that by you failing to comply, you're denying drugs from your population. That's different to the narrative right now where no one recognises it because everyone's happy enough because they have the drugs and they think that's specifically fine. This is a systematic failure on the part of the WHO to make the incentives to implement these things in a way that makes them effectively. Under our side, you can't hide it, so you eradicate government complacency. And this is important because just because you have regulations in place doesn't mean you necessarily enforce them, which means lots of governments have the correct legislation, they just don't enforce them. Because they have the legislation, they have something they can point to and say, we're doing this. Now, you expose the fact that they're not, and you incentivize them to change, that they can have access to drugs that populations need. Ultimately, the impact of this is lead to healthcare systems developing more to have to respond to this. The reason that healthcare systems in developing countries can't respond to pandemics is because things spread so quickly and you don't have the enforceability mechanisms. You have to incentivize enforceability and compliance with responsible drug regulations to A, make the drug responsible in the future, and B, even get drugs in the first place. This massively changes the incentive structures. This makes you change in a way which isn't tokenistic. I'm very proud to propose.
Thank the Prime Minister. We're very happy to welcome the Leader of Opposition.
The average typhoid outbreak kills 110 times more many people in Pakistan than it does in the United States. The reason for that is that these poor people who consume these antibiotics do not know that the medicines that have been tasked to cure them do not work any longer. Kira told you in her speech that these people, these uneducated people we admit, do not have to know about the nuances of regulation or what the biomedicine is behind this. They simply need to know that the only way I can get my drugs for my family is if the government starts regulating. We have simplified the issue for the people, and we think that's why our mechanisms for democratic mechanisms in terms of voting and other democratic mechanisms in terms of pressure will be equally effective. We think if these people are uneducated, they are not uneducated enough not to know that they need their drugs. The government has to do X to get the drugs. They will push the government to do X. The first thing I want to talk about is compliance. But before that, I think they've been disingenuous with the trade-off in this debate. I don't think the debate is about short-term versus long-term only. There's a sleeping giant across Africa, which is a rising pandemic. You do not know how do you respond to these crises. No one is talking about them. The media does not talk about them. Most importantly, the people do not know about them and the government does not talk about them. I think the chances of an outbreak happening in Africa 10 years from now is likely to kill hundreds of times of more people than it is in the short term in terms of these governments complying. I think this is really, really important to say. It's not the same amount of people in either case. Also remember that the point at which these outbreaks happen, the WHO will be slow to respond, these governments will be slow to respond, every single technocracy will be slow to respond because it didn't do what had needed to be done 10 years ago. I think this is really, really important for this debate. Let's talk about compliance. How will these states build up capacity? I think the first thing I really need to say here is that if you look at the pieces of legislation across the developing world, they are outstanding. Like if you look at the laws, you would think that you're living in like the most, like Norway or whatever, right? The problem isn't the laws. The problem is enforcement. This is true across the developing world. There's an enforcement gap. The problem is that people are elected towards sinecures and sit on their asses and don't enforce the laws that they themselves have legislated. What we're doing is pushing enforcement. What is the significance of that in this debate? This doesn't mean that the government will grapple with the multi-dimensional issues of what to do about this. They have already legislated for this. They need to create incentives for enforcement, and the best means to do that is to put pressure on the technocracy, put pressure on the executive to enforce this across the board. I think that's really important. Secondly, in terms of individual compliance, let me make this very clear in this debate. This debate is not about individual compliance. If this debate was about individual compliance, the United States and most of the EU would not have drugs because it's a massive opioid crisis happening there. I think genuinely this debate is about the government complying. Like literally their case seems to be, oh, there are so many other problems because of which drug abuse happens, hence don't do this. I disagree completely. This debate is specifically about what the government can do. The WHO is not going to be unreasonable about this. As long as the government has acted to the best reasonable degree in good faith, we think that's good enough for this. I just don't agree with this. Secondly, I think in terms of individual compliance, it's very important to recognize Kira's mechanisms as well, right? We think that the mechanisms are specifically about making sure that the pharmaceutical person tells you how much to take, the pharmaceutical person tells you what age you have to take them at, what dosage you have to take it at. The best that we can do is tell the people. We literally can't do much else. The second thing I want to say in terms of compliance, which I think is really important, is in terms of international scrutiny, a mechanism they completely missed. The WHO is now making this a fucking issue. This was not an issue before this. I think this is really, really important. The point at which it becomes an issue, the point at which in their world hundreds of thousands of people aren't getting drugs, is the point when the media is talking about this, when international organizations are pressing these governments, the point at which the WHO is pressing their governments to do something about this. I think this is really, really important. The second mechanism I want to talk about is the government. Realistically, what happens within these governments is that they literally say, look, this is a medicine. Medicine will help you. They plug medicines in. The greatest form of government complacency in this debate, unfortunately, is a massive influx of medicines to the public as a cure-all towards everything. I think that's really, really problematic because they plug drugs into the market, they plug drugs into the public sphere and say our job is done. We think that's really problematic. The more nuanced part of this, however, is what we're trying to push. That you take drugs at the right time for what is best for you. I think that's really, really important in this debate. Thirdly, let's talk about this entire idea of the black market, right? Okay, one, our enforcement structures will also trickle down towards the black market, just generally true, because if you're enforcing best medical use, then you will also trickle down those effects into the black market. So on some level, enforcement will happen. Secondly, the black market is generally uncomparative in this debate. Like 40% of people in the Philippines access the black market. I cannot stop that with this policy. What I can stop is that the people who are acting in good faith, whose government hasn't told them what to do, these are the people who have the access to proper information and proper sanctions on them if necessary to use these drugs in the best possible way. I genuinely think that's what the debate is about. The last we talked about was alternative medicines. Now I find these arguments very interesting because on one hand, hundreds of millions of people will die. On the other hand, there will be no significant government pressure because why would these people care really? I'm genuinely unclear as to how these people react in opening opposition's world because either they are all dead now and they can't protest by definition, or some of these people are protesting. I think that's the more likely scenario. No. Let's talk about the last thing in this debate, which I think is really important. Incentive to develop healthcare structures. This is generally the biggest problem in the developing world right now, which Kira spent time on. I think there's three structures which are enforced in our world. Enforcement structures, distributive structures, and research structures. What does this mean? Firstly, enforcement structures. The point at which the Ebola outbreak happened, the reason that you couldn't control the outbreak was that there was literally no one to enforce what you have to take at what time and for what purposes. You didn't have enforcement structures which could prevent this from happening. The second problem was distributive structures. Where do you get the medicine? Which areas do you need it in? How do you get that medicine there in the first place? And the third thing was research structures. What do we do even about this? We don't know what's happening with us. I think the point at which the WHO steps in and provides both a disincentive in the form of not giving drugs and an incentive in the form of technocratic experts and research, etc., is the point at which we legitimize the enforcement structure. CEO quickly, is that possible? No, fair. Go.
So on one hand, you say it's about governmental enforcement, which is easy, but on the other, you say, it's about educating the populace, which you admit is hard. Which one of them is it? Because it's either one.
No, I never said it's about educating the people. It's genuinely about making sure that the governments know which drugs to provide, where to take those drugs, what to research on. Literally, enforcement is the name of this debate. I genuinely don't think it's about anything else. But the last thing I want to talk about very importantly is that this principal debate is about should the governments be complicit with the WHO in poisoning their people. That's literally what's happening right now. I want to make this very clear, because if you are instilling a drug in a person which leads to a death at a later time, it is the literal definition of poison. The government is being complicit in poisoning their own people, and the WHO is letting it happen. 50 years from now, they will have to channel millions of dollars into an outbreak they shall not be able to control. I think that's very, very important for this debate. Fundamentally, this debate is about, in the short term, these governments have to get off their asses, help with enforcement. It's not about individual compliance. It's about making sure that these people get what they want, get what they deserve. We've shown you incentives for compliance and incentives for development. We're very, very proud of those.
Deputy Prime Minister, we're very happy to call upon the DLO.
Let's be very clear about what God's burden is in this debate. They have to tell you that the lives of people in the status quo who are currently alive and suffering from these diseases, that their livelihood is just a blip on the kind of face of trading all of them off for something that might possibly happen in the future. We think that is a horrific trade-off, and one that they cannot necessarily guarantee, one we think is actually on that quite unlikely to happen, and something they cannot justify on their side of the house. So a few things in this speech. First, we're going to talk about why they don't get the kind of sustainable healthcare they want to talk about. Secondly, we're going to talk about why their enforceability mechanisms don't work. And then thirdly, we're going to bring our third substantive, which is around alternative medicine, which we think is far more likely for people to turn to rather than a government that's probably struggling to enforce things anyway. So let's look at what they told us about sustainable healthcare. I think they were incorrect about their incentive structure here, right? Like, I think the same reason why superbug crises are just as relevant in the developed world is because it does in large part come down to individual choices, right? Like, we all know that we're supposed to finish our antibiotics course, but we don't, and we don't do it properly. And then we have the education, and we know that that's not a thing, and yet people in Western countries still deal with the same issue. So they need to prove by getting government enforcement here is going to significantly change the way people act and the way that these things actually turn down. And in doing so, they need to prove that that's justified on the people who die in the now. I think it was ridiculous that they tried to make this analogous to contraception, right? Like, people don't die in that scenario, right, when you're giving up preventative stuff. We think we need to talk about the fact that this is a preventative measure that actively sacrifices people. They haven't managed to make that trade-off sufficiently for something that's unclear, that deals with the actual reason why people often struggle with taking antibiotics in the correct way. I don't think they've done that. And we think that in this status quo anyway, we're going to end up with the black market being encouraged. They were like, that's asymmetric because the black market already exists. Quite clearly, it gets worse when people can't access what they were already able to access, that they would probably turn to it. Then they said there'll be trickle-down regulation. Like, sorry, what? Most people know that taking random harvested organs is probably not medical best practice, but the regulation didn't exactly trickle down then. So I don't think that they managed to respond to that officially by just running a generic case that, oh, we'll regulate it. I think that what they have to deal with is people turning to the black market when they are afraid. We're talking about desperate people here. We're talking about people that had what was helping them stripped out of their hands. They're going to turn to some other method. We think that method is going to be more harmful. We think there's still going to be smuggling. We think there's still going to be access to it that they wouldn't otherwise have. And that leads to all the problems Christina told you about, things like poisonous drug and unregulated corruption. We think that's a terrible thing to force people in these developing nations into. So then let's have a look at why their enforceability mechanisms won't work. I think the first thing to note here is that it's probably just ineffective in the first place, even if it was the government's fault, which I doubt, because the fact is the governments probably don't want like pandemics in their nations anyway. But the reason why this actually doesn't occur in the status quo is it's very difficult to enforce oversight over random villages in rural India that your government has lots of difficulty accessing, right? So we think for that reason it's going to be incredibly difficult for for the governments to actually do this kind of thing. So it's not a problem that the people don't want it. The issue is that governments have the inability to do it, and that putting in place this regulation means there'll be at least a few years gap at the very best case scenario where you cannot get those drugs and where people will be actively harmed in the now. They never managed to deal with that burden. So I think that's going to be a problem for them there. But what I think is more likely is that people don't have a massive amount of faith in their governments anyway in these kind of scenarios, right? So we think it's more likely to go to turn elsewhere, especially because now there's probably going to be a massive backlash towards the West in general in any kind of medicine they try to bring in, because they see them as some kind of weird overlord that will just yank away life-saving things whenever they feel like it. So we think for that reason you're more likely to have to kind of turn back to things like alternative medicine that we're going to bring you in our substandard point. It was insufficient for them to say that, oh, the World Health Organization will make it like a big international issue and then everyone will care about it. That was ridiculous, right? Like, the World Health Organization has lots of thoughts on things, but that doesn't really translate to the everyday life of someone who's working in a field in Pakistan, right? Like, it doesn't actually matter to those people what the World Health Organization says you should be doing, otherwise we wouldn't be in this problem in the first place. Yeah.
You literally said hundreds of millions of people are dying. It's really terrible, but somehow this will not be an international issue.
Okay, so first of all, I think there relies on the fact that people in those countries care about international issues. It relies on the fact that government can actually do anything to solve that issue, even if it does exist. And it relies on the fact that these people won't just turn to faith traditions that they've had years of practice in as an alternative to try and go through their terrible government that doesn't really do anything particularly well. So I think that's ridiculous to say that it is going to happen in that particular way, right? Like, human trafficking is an international issue, and that doesn't necessarily solve it for anyone. We think that what we need to deal with is individual choices of people that are doing in these nations, not rip away antibiotics for things that they cannot help. Okay, so now I'm going to bring you the point about the alternative medicine that was the final substantive point in our case. So what I'm going to tell you here is that the reason why these people, there's often already a build-up of fear and mistrust of Western medicine in these nations already, right? We think that's the reason why it's so difficult often to get vaccination programs off the ground and other forms of medicine that occur in the West. As I already said earlier in a point of rebuttal, we think it's likely there's going to be an increase of that kind of sentiment, right? Because now you see the West as willingly sacrificing your lives. Why would you trust any pill that they try to give you now, right? So I think that first of all, that has blown effects to the diseases itself, right? The actual infections that we're talking about that are caused by antibiotics, can be solved by antibiotics. Means you're more likely to turn to things that don't actually work as a result of that, right? Like, we know there are poor existing narratives that already exist in these kind of nations. Things like, oh, if I have sex with a virgin, it will cure my AIDS. That's an extreme example, right? But those are narratives that do exist within nations that you can do things without using these kind of drugs, and people are more likely to turn to them than they are to trust in things like their government, which we proven probably can't do anything, or they are in the West, which is willing to rip away anything that they had that might help them. We think they're far more likely to trust in those sorts of traditional practices. That's really harmful. Firstly, because they won't help the disease that you have, and you will have more people dying of those infections, creating the kind of pandemic which they were so concerned about happening in the future. They just bring it a few years forward and make it happen in the now. And secondly, it will go beyond the kind of diseases that were dealt with by those antibiotics into every kind of disease that you can possibly get in this country. Even if you can access drugs for it, you are more likely to turn for these other kind of medicines, meaning that all of their long-term health risks actually happen sooner in their world. And we get that kind of scenario, and we get a far worse scenario in which people do not trust medicine that we've tried so hard to bring into those nations. They were never able to grapple with the fact that there was a problem-solution mismatch in their entire case. They were never able to stop the way in which people actually acted. All they did was take away the medicine that was going to save people's lives and make pandemics all the more likely future in these developing nations. Thank you.
Please, the speakers in the top half to open the bottom half of this debate. We're happy to call the government member. Here.
What did we get in top half? We got a debate over whether the probability of a massive pandemic outweighs millions of people dying in the short run that is largely inadjudicable. We got a debate about whether countries comply, which I think there were a lot of arguments on both sides, and while we tend to agree with our opening half, we do think that there are reasons why some countries might not comply in a subset of conditions. Lastly, we have an assumption that the debate is only in the developing world, when in reality, the place in which the most antibiotics are used are in the developed world in things like factory farming. So what we're going to do is provide two extensions that are not predicated on either of the clashes that happen in opening half. First, I'm going to tell you why animals have rights, why they're the most important actor in the round, and why we help to improve the conditions under which they suffer. It's going to be considerably more exciting than opening half. Secondly, we're going to break the opening half debate by talking about why, given that this motion only applies to countries, you can still sell antibiotics to NGOs, which can still distribute them in developing countries. Cool. First, on animals. What we tell you is that conditions that animals suffer in things like factory farming, are horrible in the status quo. It looks like 50 pigs stuffed in a single cage. It looks like animals being kept in utterly filthy conditions, like hundreds of chickens floating in their own feces in factory farms. It looks like animals change so that they cannot move, even though that increases the risk of disease. The only way that these conditions are tenable is because factory farms stuff animals with hundreds and hundreds of antibiotics so that they don't get ill, even though the conditions that they live in are utterly filthy and disgusting. We think animals deserve some level of moral consideration. Why? Because they're sentient beings, and especially the ones that tend to be farmed are mammals that are incredibly similar to us. Why do they deserve moral consideration? Well, what we would posit is what gives people moral consideration is our ability to feel pain and pleasure. That is to say, the only two differences between animals and people are, one, the fact that people tend to be, on balance, more intelligent, that is, they can make more sophisticated choices, and secondly, that they have language to express those preferences. But that doesn't mean that the preferences that are then predicated on pain and pleasure that animals have aren't any less meaningful. Look, at that point then, any other standard other than pain and pleasure excludes certain people that we would care about. That is to say, if they want to talk about how intelligence might be a standard for why we give certain actors more rights, that excludes people like the disabled or like infants that we do think deserve some moral consideration. So at that point then, this is an actor you do need to care about in the round. I'll explain why they're more important than people later. Secondly, though, conditions won't improve for animals in the status quo. First of all, because people just don't care about animals. That is to say, people ignore the problem and there isn't sufficient media coverage for these kinds of issues. Secondly, big corporate influence and lobbying and things like that on countries' governments ensures that countries do not pass more stringent regulations. That is to say, that is the link for the OG argument as to why even in the developed world, you have countries like the United States not enforcing WHO regulations on big corporations. No. Thirdly, there isn't any sort of discourse about these issues. Animals aren't talked about in major forums of public thought, so that means conditions for these animals will never improve in the status quo. So what changes on our side? No. First, when animals get sick, there is a huge cost to firms. That is to say, diseases spread really quickly within the close conditions in factory farms, which means if there is a chance that animals are going to get sick, that is absolutely devastating to the overhead costs firms face because there's a huge investment per animal. At that point then, note that this argument, when antibiotics are not able to be used, then what that means is you have to give these animals decent conditions in which they have space to roam and live to a degree in which they can be healthy, or else they're very likely to get sick. Note that this is true whether countries change their regulations or not, because in either case you're using far less antibiotics. Why is this the most important issue? First of all, because most antibiotics are used in agriculture in the world, a part of the debate that was not touched in opening half. Secondly, even if you think animals deserve 1/100th of the moral consideration, the first thing to note is that there are literally trillions of animals suffering in factory farms, so the scale of the impact is substantially larger than on people, even if your intuition is that people matter more. But secondly, the magnitude of the harm is immense. That is to say, look, I will literally take some people dying of typhoid fever if it means we liberate hundreds of millions of animals for a kind of suffering that we can barely even conceive because it is so fucking terrible. At that point then, I am comfortable with the trade-off that we make. Next thing to note, though, why is there a special obligation to animals that we think the WHO needs to protect? First of all, because there is a lottery of birth that applies to animals as well. That is to say, generally the reason why we think that we should have moral obligations to other people is because we could have been born in their place. That is equally true of animals, not just people. Secondly, our lives, our very existence, is dependent upon the kind of suffering that we impose on animals. So what that does is then it imposes a reciprocal obligation on us to take care of them, even if it leads to more suffering for people. Lastly, though, even if you don't buy any of this, I still think it's good for people if conditions for animals get better in factory farms. Why? Because the vast majority of the pandemics and diseases that opening government talks about come from animals, right? That is to say, things like swine flu, things like HIV, all of these made the gap, jumped from animals to people, and then there weren't things like antibiotics that were able to stop them, which is how you got things like the Spanish flu that killed millions millions and millions of people. So if you buy opening government's arguments, our arguments about animals now become the necessary link for them to achieve the probability of pandemic that their arguments rely on. I'll take opening. Really quick.
Okay, given that you probably won't convince literal factory farmers to buy into any of the analysis that you've just given, why won't they just use brutal overbreeding methods, which are still cheaper than letting your animals roam free range?
No, you just didn't listen to me, right? Like, you can't overbreed animals because what that does is increases the probability that animals get sick, and then it can be spread rapidly. Secondly, though, these firms have to comply. Like, the black market cannot solve for these kinds of firms to be able to get these sorts of drugs. So you need to be able to comply in order to get antibiotics in the first place. Second extension we want to bring you, NGOs. Look, this is going to be the link to the DPM's arguments of distributive structures. The first thing to note is that NGOs don't face the ban imposed by opening government. Why? Because they don't actually, they aren't, first of all, they aren't countries, but secondly, more importantly, they are more likely to actually have systems of distribution which comply with regulations that the WHO has. At that point, then, there are two impacts on them. First of all, this will artificially lower demand for drug prices in the world in which countries continue to ban them, in which case prices go down a lot. Secondly, though, this makes countries that do ban these kinds of drugs more reliant. There are a couple things to note. First of all, government distribution of antibiotics in the status quo is often terrible. First, because there's political capture by the rich that ensures that the majority of antibiotics in countries in which there's high demand go to places that are wealthy. Secondly, they're often the exclusion of minority groups or ethnic groups that aren't within the fold. Thirdly, there's distribution only in urban areas where the vast majority of voters tend to be in these countries. At that point, then, on our side of the house, these NGOs are likely to receive massive grants by international organizations, which they can use to purchase much larger numbers of drugs that have become cheaper and that are able to distribute them, creating their own networks that are already pre-existing in most of these countries. NGOs are way less exclusive because they don't have any of the incentives that I've already talked about, which means if you want to talk about people who are dying, in the status quo, there are lots of millions of people that are already dying because they can't get access to antibiotics in the first place. On our side of the house, where NGOs take over that distribution from government, it means that you're more likely to get antibiotics to people that need them most. It also means that, like, local towns, the kinds of people that don't trust Western medicine, like they're talking about, are more likely to welcome in NGOs, because often is the case that local towns don't even accept NGO help in the first place, but now they need it, which means it's far more likely you get antibiotics to people who need them the most. For all these reasons, we're incredibly proud.
We thank the government member, and we're very happy to call the member of opposition.
No one in this debate has even thought about who the World Health Organization is. We tell you it's overwhelmingly Western nations. It's overwhelmingly developed nations. And we will tell you in our second prong for extension why specifically these nations not only should, generally let people die, as I always say, but have a specific duty to the developing world, which because of them, by process of a colonization, by processes of slavery, and now by process of the constrictive intellectual property regulations, have allowed them to sit in the place they sit now and are susceptible to these specific kinds of diseases. We have a moral duty to them, and there is a principle at stake here as well. But beyond that, we'll also give you two more extensions from CO. So, first of all, on what we heard from CG regarding factory farms and animals. Look, first thing they say, we should give animals the same level of consideration as humans. I would posit that, first of all, on a superficial note, no, probably humans are superior to animals because they lead way more complex lives, they have way more complex organizations, and more importantly, they have consciousness and literally feel pain and can recognize themselves in mirrors. But even if you don't buy this, recognize they don't help these animals. Critically, this motion still means that these animals will be slaughtered in probably the third week of their lives because we need piglets for our bacon, right? Just because you marginally increase the quality of their life compared to many humans dying doesn't mean that's an actual extension or that actually matters, because it's uncomparative. They still die, they're still slaughtered, right? But even more so, we tell you that anyway, how effective is this going to be, right? Who will enforce this while millions of people in the country are dying? Who will care about these animals and make the causation? The WHO cared about the lives of animals, will protect them, as well. Anyway, lastly, we tell you there's other ways to protect these animals. Use the World Trade Organization and don't allow the selling of animals which have been kept in outrageous conditions. Use the subsidies we give to agriculture in developing nations as leverage in order to determine what ways these animals will be kept in. Now, on to the 3 points in my speech. First of all, and this leads me on to my first extension. So notice opening government indeed focuses a lot on saying these are systemic issues which are hard to solve, right? Kira says our solution is we'll put pressure on the government and to change this enforcement mechanisms. Notice I noticed in a POI that this takes a long time. A series of reasons why applying this pressure on the government means it's a very long time until it actually occurs. There are several steps you have to go through for opening government's reasoning to work. A, the population must realize the lack of drugs is because of lack of governmental regulation specifically. Second, the population has to aggregate in meaningful voting blocks which create political manifestos which then win elections and then overhaul governments, thus putting pressure on them. Third of all, the response from the government has to be very quick. Notice these are governments which overwhelmingly are very bureaucratic and do not have the measures to create quick change. And lastly, recognize the educating the population bit about how they should act and actual enforcement as they want it takes a long time. All the while, many people are dying. First of all, we point out that so many people are dying, hundreds of millions will die in this time frame. Why? Because the scale of this will be huge. Because the spread in these diseases with no antibiotics in the country becomes exponential. Now there are hundreds of people with typhoid fever, but when there's no antibiotics in the country, it becomes thousands in a week, it becomes 100,000 in several weeks, right? Crucially, these are also debilitating diseases. They're TBC, they're typhoid fever. All of this means two things. First of all, not only millions of people will die, but it makes it harder to implement your measures as well, right? Because A, people have different priorities now that they're dying. They focus on palliative care. They focus on caring for their families instead of how should they lobby the government to change. Second of all, we tell you most importantly, and this is again entering our first point of extension, it also means the methods by which enforcement is done become way more difficult to happen because civil service people are dying, right? Because the media is in breakdown because either A, there's not people listening to the television, but also people in the media are contracting these diseases as well. Hospitals are overflowing with urgency, thus can't focus on education, right? That they have millions of people dying in their beds. So making this measure makes it way harder in terms of pragmatics, not only because of the hate to the West of OSAs, but in terms of pragmatics from actually solving this, right? Even further, we tell you we could apply pressure on this government in other ways, right? We do have economic sanctions which focus, for example, on luxury goods or on freezing assets of people in the government. If we care so much about this, we should apply them instead of targeting the population. Second extension, we tell you that who is the World Health Organization? It's overwhelmingly controlled by nations such as the UK, Germany, US, and the Netherlands. Crucially, these countries have a duty to keep alive these people who are in the scenario of being susceptible to these diseases because of these Western nations. Why? Because they colonized them overwhelmingly. Because a lot of times they destroyed infrastructure in senseless wars, such as in Libya, such as in Iraq, such as in Afghanistan. They actively plundered them, the US and the work of African Americans. But more importantly now, they developed systems in which they have monopoly on pharma companies, right? And more importantly, have created constrictive intellectual property laws and practices such as evergreening of patents, which do not allow developing countries to create generic alternatives to their medicine. These are clear reasons for which they have a principal duty to help these people which are suffering and can develop their own alternatives because Western nations did not allow them to. More importantly, this kind of scenario is because of us. What OG is saying is, now that we've realized a super bug might haunt the Western world as well, now we care about developing countries. Well, fine, A, it's too late, but second of all, you should be caring about the people which are directly impacted by them. Third point we tell you, after we've told you that millions of people dying literally means that you can't deal with the actual issue or the appearance of a superbug because urgency is the priority. Last thing we tell you is, if we're talking about the probabilities of a wide and global epidemic, the threat of large populations having diseases that mutate in every single individual, and then if there is a large population in aggregation, many mutations in many individuals, mean it's likelier to get that superbug than if a few individuals use antibiotics stupidly. This is crucial because aggregation of mutations happens all the time. That's why large populations develop strains of bugs which do not, if they get sick, develop strains of bugs which we can't deal with. Even more so, A, you have mutations which are far larger probability than the possibility of a super product from a few people with antibiotics. But second of all, the probability of those mutations developing and then becoming a global pandemic because of aggregation of sick people is even worse when you have a breakdown in public order. When borders fall because so many people in your country are dying and you don't have soldiers to protect them, then it can spread, right? So that neglects the ability of the WHO to contain it as well, right? Because there's a breakdown in public order in these countries, because millions of people are dying, it's likelier for you to get a global pandemic, A, because the disease gets worse, and B, you can't control it, can't contain it, can't deal with it. So for all these reasons, the Western nations which make up the WHO have a duty to these people not to let them, because we didn't give them any alternatives. And lastly, it will all get worse and hundreds of millions of people die.
I think the opposition member to the government bench, we're very happy to call the government with.
Is that ready? Cool. The opening up of the debate, which does heavily rely on compliance, completely misses and ignores what causes epidemics in the first place. It's animals that are kept in cruel conditions in which they are locked in cages together, which means that any animal that is sick passes that disease on to other animals. That is how the swine flu passed on to individuals. This is massively problematic because individuals have the ability, as opening up tells you, to choose not to take antibiotics and choose not to take them for a long period of time. Animals don't have that choice on our side of the house. This means that we can force these animals to take these specific antibiotics because these specific companies that use the animals in order to make profit, the governments that rely on these animals in order to make profit, now are forced to give these animals antibiotics, which means that we are better at preventing these epidemics from spreading to human beings. Look, the World Health Organization regulations which need to be enforced are mostly the ones on agriculture. So if OG proved that countries comply, then the conditions improve because they're banning stuffing animals to them. Secondly, if OG lost that countries enforce regulations, drug sales to that country are banned and firms don't get to use them. Either way, closing government takes the round. I'm going to ask 4 questions, sort of sum up what the clash was. First, what is the effect on people? Second, what is the effect on distribution? Third, what is the effect on large corporations that use this type of farming? And fourth, what is the effect of NGOs, and why are all these massively important? On the effect on people, look, we get from opening opposition that individuals take these drugs and they don't take it actually for the long term. Like, pretty bold to actually rest all of your impacting on the fact that individuals actually take these in the long term. What we tell you is that these individuals don't necessarily have to take these in the long term, which means that those individuals who didn't believe in antibiotics in the first place then get sick on their side of the house. What happens on our side of the house is that we change this by changing the narrative of antibiotics. Secondly, though, there are still large middle-class areas that will use antibiotics, so I think the characterization of the developing world that we get from opening opposition, probably unfair characterization, given the fact that there are many individuals who have jobs they need to continue to go to and have literally an incentive to take the drugs. So either way, even if you buy either of the clash that exists on the opening half of the debate, I think that we still take it because we provide the link analysis that was missing from opening government. Second question on how this affects distribution. Recognize that a lot of the countries that we're talking about in this round massively rely on agriculture in order to, 1, employ a lot of people, and secondly, to generate government revenue. This is massively problematic because what happens on this is massively important because what happens on our side of the house when you ban the regulating, ban the drugs because they're not complying with regulation, forces these companies to actually comply with regulation, but secondly, forces these governments to actually enforce that regulation in the first place. Sure, we buy that developing countries have the ability to enforce regulation on people. The problem is that it's really difficult to enforce regulation on outside corporations because they have to comply with outside corporate incentives. What we do is we tie the incentives of the government to the incentives of the corporation to the incentives of the government, which means that any and all regulation that was already in existence is now fully in compliance with. Sure.
Okay, so PEX relies on 2 things. Firstly, it's that diseases actually, for the most part, come from animals. Secondly, it also relies on the fact that there isn't that massive gap in which the government is able to enforce these kind of measures, in which there's food shortages and a pandemic now.
Cool. So there isn't a massive gap in which you are able. So in the status quo, there is a gap in which you are actually able to enforce these measures because you've never actually tied antibiotics and actual disease to the actual narrative of farming in the first place. What we change on our side of the house is we tie these two things together. So if a firm is not in compliance with the regulation, the government therefore has to ban giving those specific antibiotics to them. So they're complying with the World Health Organization's regulations on actually how they distribute those specific antibiotics. So if the firm no longer complies with it, they can just distribute those antibiotics in a different manner. Look, we're saying that if you buy into any of the argumentation that we give you on closing government, on how these actually, how these countries actually comply with these, then we say that we solve for this. Cool. Thirdly, on how this affects large firms and factory farming. Firstly, on how this affects the individual firms. Recognize that the individual firms rely on a lot of these animals in order to, one, gain their profit, and two, gain any of their optic mechanisms which are also tied into their profit, i.e. investment and shares. This means that they need the animals to be maintained in better conditions in order to get the antibiotics from the government, because if the government gives them the antibiotics anyway, then they are strictly not complying with World Health Organization regulations, which means they don't get any of the antibiotics for anyone within the country. So you raise the stakes way higher. This means that these firms now have to comply with things like letting the animals actually roam free and changing the actual standard of living that exists for these specific animals. Why? Because in order to actually convince the government that you are not going to be the actual spread of disease within that country, as we told you is going to happen, actually happens in the status quo, you need to show them that you're actually not treating the animals in ways that would allow for the spread of disease. This means that on our side of the house, you actually allow for more animal rights. What do we get out of closing opposition? Closing opposition says, but these animals are going to die anyway, and that doesn't change the actual quality of life of that animal. The thing is that debate is a comparative, right? If we comparatively change the actual life of the animal while it is alive, then we're marginally better, at least for these specific animals. We told you that animals have rights in the status quo. One, because of all the reasons that closing opposition tells you. They're sentient. They can create large organizations and communities. They have the ability to communicate with one another. They have the ability to feel pain. These are all things that we can even see and witness, for example, in dogs when we look at them, or like the only reason that we actually allow them to exist in such comfort is because they're cute. That allows for the lottery of birth argument that Arabi gives you on our side of the house. Look, we say that even if you buy that there are like literally 1/1,000,000th of rights of animals that they have to human beings, there are literally trillions of animals that outweighs any of the impacts that they give you for specifically human beings. But lastly, how does this affect people? Recognize that on our side of the house, we get healthier animals, which means that individuals in these countries are eating healthier foods. But secondly, it means that if we have healthier animals, it means that the specific individuals who would have gotten diseases from these animals, i.e. the individuals who have to actually work on these farms in the first place, the individuals who need to be protected a lot of times and don't become protected by a lot of these specific regulations, because the regulations don't necessarily go towards their specific areas, means that those individuals are actually protected on our side of the house. Lastly, on how this affects NGOs. Look, NGOs are the actual link of how you provide any form of education that is supposed to come from opening government. On our side of the house, we empower NGOs because they're the only arbiters that are able to actually distribute these antibiotics in the first place. Because if the government of a country is actually banned from distributing these antibiotics, that means that you have to rely on NGOs in order to get them in the first place. One, this increased trust to NGOs, which are the arbiters of the education of a lot of individuals who don't necessarily trust the government, i.e. individuals who are ethnic minorities. Look, we're better for animals, we're better for people, very proud to be here.
The governor's whip. To conclude the round, we're very happy to call the opposition whip.
Before I go on to my points of summary, I want to clarify one thing which was mentioned in Tudor's speech and went entirely unresponded to, some of the most important material in the round. All of opening government's benefits and policy is dependent on the idea that these bureaucratic officials are lazy, right? That it's their fault and that they are doing things wrong. What Tudor tells you is that they are the victims of a long-term project of colonization. Why are these people susceptible to epidemics and using these drugs wrongly? It's because things like because they are poor, because the price of a doctor is relatively high. It is because often should give up their patents. We, the West, instead should make the effort. We think the West instead the burden is on the West to make this better, as opposed to punishing people by literally murdering them as a means to an end. Okay, before we do that, let's look at the brief responses we got to Tudor's extension. So first of all, no response to the absolutely crucial idea that any educational government response requires all state services not to be overrun with cases of dysentery, overrun with cases of TBC and yellow fever and typhus and things like that. There is no capacity for the state to implement any of their policies when there is no popular will to do so. Right? So we have absolutely no response to this idea. Therefore, we think all of the government metrics on which their arguments have operated, we think kind of fall out of the debate at that point because they have not proved that. Crucially, we prove why people who have dysentery and people who have those kinds of non-viral diseases that we think that those are the people who are supposed to be campaigning against the government. Those are the people who are supposed to be going and boycotting, state services or let's say crowding around local offices. You can't do that if there is an epidemic on because you are more concerned that your mother is dying. You're more concerned about the immediate plight of your family. You're more concerned about not traveling so you don't encounter people who might be infected. All of these things are reasons why we think their policy directly contradicts the idea of having any kind of no thank you meaningful response to this epidemic. So, that being said, in light of those two extensions, again, when absolutely unresponded to, let's have a look at what we did get in this debate. The first thing that we get is a sustainable path to development. So, what does this mean? Notice that, what this will involve is creating, in order to, let's say, get prescriptions for people, you will have to create a database of everyone that exists in the country, which we think is so ambitious, given that often this will include going around very densely overpopulated settlements, trying to do a birth count, right? This means, reaching very, very distant settlements and things like that, right? And also bear in mind that we think all of the fiat of NGOs in this motion is kind of limited by the fact that NGOs lose credibility at the point where they are associated with the West, which is literally causing an epidemic, where there is a clear cause and response relationship between that. Secondly, we think the idea of change assumes a democratic structure. Their whole case was that these bureaucratic officials are happy with poisoning the entire population. If they are happy with poisoning the population, and they are getting the nice bribes or whatever it is that keeps them in power, we are unclear why necessarily they care that much about people dying in different ways, right? Because all of their analysis was contingent upon a corrupt government, which is existingly corrupt and hurting and harming and killing its population, suddenly caring about that. But also, again, the crucial material in this debate never responded to the idea that health services are overrun with cases of dysentery, and that therefore makes it very difficult to have a meaningful response. No, thank you. Okay, let's also look at the idea of a long-term epidemic. Tudor tells you a crucial piece of material in this debate, which is the phenomenon of mutation is not exclusive to for example, things that you would use antibiotics for. The phenomenon of mutation happens when there is an enormous population which all has one particular disease, right? Something like dysentery or yellow fever or something like that. So, if there is an enormous population having the disease, which must necessarily happen, because not only does it logically follow, but they also fucking rely on it in order to get any of their efficacy, right? Yeah. So let's say that so they have this enormous disease population. We think that the likelihood of an epidemic is far, far greater at that point. Then you get a super strand of something which is able to resist all drug. So, crucially, what we think we've proved to you here is that there is no way that they can have efficacy in their world, right? Because the metric by which they get from a system where nothing works to a system where everything works is not only killing a bunch of people in a moral way, but creating the epidemic that they wanted to prevent, and also destroying the structures of power which might be able to enforce that kind of thing, and destroying the credibility of the WHO. Before we move on, yes, opening.
Okay, all of these harms in your extension of epidemic spreading is uncomparative to the bigger scope for this to happen when healthcare systems are permanently unsustainable because we've rendered our only tools to manage them totally ineffective.
But how are they your only tools to manage them when they are also responsible for stopping all of the diseases which you must necessarily have in order to create the supposed population pressure in order to create change, right? Remember that your metric is lots of people get diseases, those people then somehow, go and campaign for change, then change happens, right? So in the intermediary period, you're literally relying on an epidemic existing, right? That is your metric. That is how you do things. And aside from any moral qualms you might have about that, we think it is extraordinarily ineffective. So, let's deal with the extension. The first thing to say about this extension is the idea that NGOs distribute drugs for free, we think is the very definition of against the spirit of the motion. Not only is it a direct knife, we think it's like a direct, samurai sword into their opening case, right? We don't think it's fair to just say, we're not technically selling them, so we can just distribute them for free, okay, regardless of the fact that they still have to, buy them in order to distribute them. The idea that suddenly prices drop, we think was incredibly underanalyzed, okay? So I think that extension bit falls out of the debate. Now let's deal with the animal rights stuff. So, first of all, we think that Tudor's response still stands, which is to say, if you improve the life of a chicken from living in shit to living in a cage without any shit for approximately 3 weeks. We think that is comparatively worse than maybe adding 20 years to the life of someone in a developing country. We think even the comparison is pretty insulting. Okay, and what else do we tell you, right? They tell you that their metric here is that what we do is like we pressure the government to start doing agriculture well. Judith tells you that we can use subsidies and other metrics in order to lobby these corporations. But also look what their metric is, right? So these animals live in cages where they're infected. So you stop giving them the drugs, but like, what do they still feed the food to people? They're feeding people food which is contaminated, causing an epidemic, which is the entirety of this motion has been attempting to prevent, right? But even if, let's say, they manage to get some sort of long-term, there is some sort of long-term efficacy, and the long-term government suddenly decide to start regulating these companies. If that is the case, we think the distance between that time the distance between now and that time is a time in which lives will be lost. It's a time in which countries will be ruined. And is a time in which epidemics will spread beyond borders, beyond the capacity to contain it, creating the hell world which we were warned against. I am so proud to oppose. Thank you.
Give a big hand to all speakers in the round.